Hello everybody, welcome to Totally Tabled. My name is Shaggy, and today I'm running down my top 10 least cozy solo games. This is a quick follow-up to my last list, the top 10 coziest solo board games. I thought it might be fun to look at the opposite, the most stressful solo board games. And I'm going to spoil a little bit right away by saying Robinson Crusoe will not appear on this list. Let's put it down as an honorable mention, because for most people, Robinson Crusoe would totally belong on this list. Obviously, it's an incredibly stressful game. Well, for me personally, I don't find it to be that stressful. In fact, it's like comfort food for me to play Robinson Crusoe. So I couldn't in good conscience put it on the list, even though it probably belongs there. Okay, enough of that. Let's jump right in. Number 10 is Resist. Resist is a solo-only card game where you play resistance fighters after the Spanish Civil War. You control a small group of people represented by these cards, and you're going to play them out to try to complete missions and overcome obstacles. The trick is each of these character cards has a hidden side and a revealed side. Typically, the revealed side is more powerful and has more powerful special abilities, but they're gone for the game. When you play them on their hidden side, you put them in a discard pile and you can use them again for future missions. And that's what makes this game so stressful. Your squad of fighters is constantly dwindling throughout the game. You're getting weaker and weaker as the missions are getting more and more difficult. You have these spy cards coming into your deck, which is just, weakening your hand. And brilliantly, you can decide when you want the game to end. You have all these different ways that you can lose, and you may decide to take a sort of a weakened victory because you just don't think that you can go on and complete another mission. It's such a brutal game. It feels so hopeless. Go check out my full playthrough if you want to see it in action. And in fact, I just recently did a full playthrough of the follow-up game, Witchcraft. Witchcraft uses very similar mechanisms, a few extra things here or there, but overall I find it a little less stressful than Resist. Resist seems like the more hardcore version. Anyway, there you go. That's my number 10. Number 9 is Bloc by Bloc Uprising. Bloc by Bloc has this wonderful, intriguing theme of taking back the streets from an oppressive regime. You'll be moving about the city, trying to liberate key areas, maybe looting to get supplies and these really powerful cards. You might be setting up barricades. And all the while, these cops are swarming all over the city, coming at you relentlessly. There are these SWAT vans that are just pouring police out of them. And the way that they move around and fan out throughout the city is very organic. It feels really real. Because the map of the city is randomized for each game, you really have to study the different choke points and the critical intersections. You need to really find the safe blocks and focus on which roads you need to barricade and which buildings you need to burn and which neighborhoods you need to liberate. And I don't know, as the police start swarming around you and coming in, I find the whole thing to be incredibly stressful. So that's my number 9, Bloc by Bloc Uprising. Number 8 is Pandemic Iberia. This is really for the pandemic system in general. You can pick your favorite pandemic. Iberia is my favorite, personally, just because I like the historical setting. But I find Pandemic to be an incredibly stressful game, first, just because of the theme. I'm very much a germaphobe, so I find this theme to be pretty unnerving. And of course, COVID didn't help that. But second, just the mechanisms for how the diseases move, how they infect, and how outbreaks occur. And then you get that epidemic. And you have to take the discard pile of all the different cities that are getting infected, shuffle that up, and then put it on top of the deck, which means that those cities are going to get infected again, which means they're more likely to outbreak. It's truly an ingenious system. I do really like some of the things that Iberia adds, including getting to build out the railroad to increase your speed. That's a wonderful little strategic choice because you kind of have to sacrifice a little short term in order to gain some advantage long term. Lots of great little twists and touches in Iberia. But again, any pandemic is fantastic. That's my number 8, Pandemic Iberia. Number 7 is Arkham Horror, the card game. This is obviously a cooperative adventure campaign game set in a Lovecraftian world of madness. So, of course, the theme here and all of the craziness that happens is fairly stressful. I don't know, fighting ancient ones is not necessarily the most cozy thing in the world. And if you really let yourself get into the theme, it gets incredibly stressful. Lots of action, lots of horror, lots of nerve-wracking exploration a lot of times where you're, flipping over cards and you don't know what kind of monster is gonna await you. But the most stressful thing about the game is the chaos bag. I believe that's what it's called, if I remember correctly. For a lot of the actions and the checks in the game, you have to draw into the chaos bag one of these chaos tokens, and it's going to modify your value. And a lot of times you just have negatives in there. And you also have an instant fail token. So drawing those tokens out of that chaos bag is easily one of the most stressful things in any solo game. It's maybe topped by just one other thing that we're going to get to here very shortly. But there you go. That's number 7, Arkham Horror LCG. Number 6 is Nemesis. I always describe Nemesis as the unofficial Aliens the board game. It's cinematic, sci-fi, survival horror that you can play in many different ways, and arguably the competitive multiplayer is the most stressful. So that level of stress is reduced in the cooperative or the solo version. But even despite that, the solo game is incredibly nerve-wracking. You're exploring this derelict spaceship that's infested with these hostile aliens that are legitimately dangerous. Like, you are scared to have encounters. You are sneaking around, you're having to leave noise tokens in your wake. You're trying not to accumulate too much noise in one place, because if you do, you could have an alien encounter that could result in instant death. And if not that, probably infection, which is just as horrific. And so the more you walk around, the more the terror builds as you see the noise slowly fill up in the corridors. Every roll of that noise die is just nerve-wracking. And then when an alien appears, you draw it out of the bag. You don't know what you're going to draw. It could be a little harmless guy who really they're not that harmless, or it could be the queen in your face. If you want to see exactly what I'm talking about, just go watch my playthrough. Oh, there's just so much atmosphere in this. It's so great. Nemesis, that's my number 6. Number 5 is Ghost Stories. Ghost Stories is a cooperative tower defense game where you take the role of warrior monks protecting a village from nightmare spirits. You're moving around a 3x3 grid, and you're either taking a special action that's on the tile, or you're fighting off these ghosts by spending resources and rolling dice. The game is notoriously punishing, and part of that is because the ghosts are unrelenting. They're constantly coming in. You're surrounded on all 4 sides, and they're just non-stop. There's just this claustrophobic feeling of just being slowly crushed, and the night just slowly closing in. And the absolute worst are the spirits that actually spawn additional spirits. That is so bad. I've definitely had some games of Ghost Stories where it just feels so hopeless, and you just get completely overrun. One of the most stressful feelings that I've ever had in a board game. So there you go. That's my number 5, Ghost Stories. Number 4 is Frostpunk. Now, there's obviously going to be a lot of survival games on this list. Frostpunk is a little unique because you kind of take a step up and you're really doing city planning. But in some ways that makes it even more stressful because you have an entire society that you have to take care of that are relying on you. And you're making critical, meaningful decisions that will mean the difference between life and death. But I think it's really the setting that gets to me. You're living in a bleak, frozen apocalypse, and you're building out your little village around a giant generator. The heat of this giant generator is the only thing keeping you alive. I mean, it's such a brutal setting. And the thought of knowing that if you run out of fuel or if something happens to this generator, then you're just going to freeze to death and there's nothing you can do about it. Crazy. But there's just so much that you have to manage and stay on top of. Every time you send someone out to do a cold action, they're going to get sick. You have to deal with their hunger. You really have to focus on morale and make sure that you're keeping on top of that. If morale starts to get out of control, unrest takes over, everything starts going downhill. You have to build shelters for everyone or they'll get too cold and get sick. And then on top of all of that, you have these events that are coming up all the time. A lot of times you're having to choose the lesser of two evils. It's kind of like having the most stressful government job imaginable. And add on to that the game is brutally difficult and you're most likely going to die. Frostpunk is a stressful game, but I love it. That's my number 4. Number 3 is Halls of Hegra. Halls of Hegra is another solo-only game where you play as the commander of a group of Norwegian volunteers fighting an overwhelming German force from an abandoned mountain fortress in the early days of World War II. This is another tower defense survival game at heart, but there's a lot going on here. There's bag building, action selection with different workers, pickup and delivery, resource management, there's a morale system, and dice-based combat. And the tension in this game just keeps ratcheting up round after round after round. In the early rounds, you're kind of just building up, you're taking care of, little skirmishes here and there, you're getting resources and recruiting your fighters and, collecting gear and stuff. But man, at the end, it just gets so stressful as wave after wave of German soldiers just continuously come at you. You're getting bombed and things are breaking down and your fighters are getting injured and you're having to heal them up in the hospital and you're running short of supplies. And it's just one of those games where you're just barely trying to hang on till the very end, just doing your best to just barely avoid defeat for as long as possible. It's one of the most harrowing and memorable endings of a game that I've experienced in a long time. It honestly feels almost unwinnable at times, and I really feel satisfied if I can even just make it to that final showdown, that last stand. A really intense and long epic game, but well worth it. I love it. My number 3, Halls of Hegra. My number 2 is Final Girl. This is another solo-only survival game, and really you should think of Final Girl as a gaming system. You have a ton of different scenarios that you can choose from, each one kind of riffing on a horror trope. Every single horror movie or TV show or story is here, from classic slasher films to some stranger sci-fi and fantasy stuff. Basically, each one of these little scenario boxes that you can buy has a different location and villain with unique rules and special abilities that really try to capture a horror atmosphere. There's a lot of sort of unique, stressful stuff in each one of these boxes. Some of them are a little bit more serious, some of them are a little bit more silly. But I think one of the things that Final Girl does so well is that it really makes you feel vulnerable. And I think a lot of that has to do with the way it uses dice. For everything you do in this game, you're going to be playing out these action cards. But then you have to roll dice to see how well you activate that card, if at all. There's different sort of tiers of success. So even to move, you have to play a card and then roll these dice, and you may not be able to get as far as you wanted to. And that makes you feel scared and helpless and vulnerable. At any time you could mess up, and usually it'll happen at the worst possible time. That's good. That's the kind of feeling that you want in a survival game, and that's what really brings out the stress. When you're trying to run away from the killer and you know that these dice could really mess you up, those are some great tense and cinematic moments. And Final Girl does that better than almost any other game. There you go. That's my number 2, Final Girl. And number 1 is, of course, This War of Mine. I might talk about This War of Mine as much as Robinson Crusoe at this point, but there's no game that comes even close to being as stressful as this one. I just talked about that feeling of being vulnerable, and man, in This War of Mine, you play not soldiers, but just regular people caught in the middle of a war, just trying to survive the physical and mental toll. Day by day, in excruciating detail, you're scrounging a bombed out house looking for supplies. I mean, your characters have to both eat and drink in this game. There's a mechanism where they each have an empathy number, where if they see something horrific, it's how much it affects them. You can lose a character because they just become too depressed. But of course, there's wounds and sickness. You need medicine, you need bandages. You have to go out into the night and explore to find critical components and food that you need. Bring it back to the house and then defend your house from outsiders coming in, mobs trying to steal your stuff. I've had to make some brutal decisions in this game, and there's nothing more stressful. As much as I love this war of mine, I have to be in a very special mood to want to play it. Most of the time, this would just be way too much for me to handle. But when I do get it to the table, it's such a meaningful experience, it's worth all the stress 100 times over. And there you go, that's my number 1, this war of mine. And there we go, 10 of my favorite stressful games. The absolute least cozy games I can think of. Which games did I miss? Please let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed the channel, think about subscribing and watching all of the playthrough videos. I've done playthroughs of most of the games on this list. Well, that's all for me. Thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.